Hello, everybody, and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, the 10-week conference brought to you by AHEAD, exploring topics concerning inclusion, disability support, and universal design for learning in FET and higher education. I know many of you are experiencing a bit of digital fatigue at this stage, so I thank you all for joining us, and I promise you'll come away feeling rewarded for engaging with us today. My name is Dara Ryder. I'm the CEO of AHEAD. And if you're unfamiliar with AHEAD and this is your first time engaging with us, we are an independent non-profit organisation focused on creating inclusive environments in education and employment for people with disabilities. I'd ask that you show us a little bit of understanding in the session today, and that we're delivering them from less than ideal circumstances, in some case from home and domestic broadband connections in family settings. And I know that we have several dogs amongst the panelist group here today in the background. So if you hear dogs barking, children maybe in the background, please forgive us that. So thankfully, if my own connection, if I have any problems, my own connection drops, I have my wonderful co-host Trevor Boland on hand to step in. How are you, Trevor? How are you doing?
Hello, how are you? More than happy to be here this week. Looking forward to yet another Friday webinar with yourself, Dara, and attendees. It just seems to be the perfect way to end the week. Uh, or certainly just becoming the norm every week now.
I
So
know, yeah. I think when this conference ends, I'm going to be left at in a bit of a strange place on a Fridays, wondering what to do with myself.
I say we just keep going, like go up to webinar 52 or something like that. Until the COVID issue stops, we just keep going.
So I'm actually delighted with to welcome you onto the session anyway. We have a brilliant session in store for you today. We have a session around UDL for FET with my ex-colleague from AHEAD, Mary Quirk, and the wonderful Dr. Patricia McCarthy. We'll follow that up with a session from Carrie Archer from City of Dublin Education and Training Board, which, by the way, we have some of the best names for sessions, I think, happening this week. So Kerry's session is Curiouser and Curiouser, support teachers in City of Dublin Education and Training Board and training centre, sorry, sharing curiosities. I love that idea, sharing curiosities. And then Carol has, I think, even gone above that, and beyond that again with her name. Hers is called Unpacking the Jabberwocky of Inclusion in Cork Education and Training Board. So fascinated to see what Carol Neenans from Cork Education and Training Boards is about too. It's great to see so many of you already using the chat feature. So just a little bit of housekeeping there. There are a few ways you can engage with us. The chat feature, as we mentioned, is at the bottom of the Zoom window here. So you can engage with other participants in the session there. That's other people watching along with you, other people watching along with you. So you can comment, perhaps post relevant resources, that kind of thing into the chat box. And actually, if you could post into the chat box in the next few minutes where you're joining us from today and maybe what your role is, that would be nice just to get you engaging with each other and introducing each other. So Trevor, who's the co-host here today, on his digital media and e-learning officer with AHEAD, he's the kind of king of the chat box. So he'll be there liaising with you in there and posting links that might be relevant to the conversation at different times too. And he'll also be keeping an eye on the Q&A feature, which is also on the bottom of your screen. Now the Q&A feature is when you want to pose a question very specifically towards one of our contributors. So the chat's for general sharing between each other. The Q&A is if you want to ask a question. So I'll be keeping an eye on that throughout the session and seeking to put some of those questions to our contributors at the end of their sessions, and Trevor might answer some directly within the Q&A panel itself. So later on, we'll actually be engaging you in a Zoom poll as well. So that's basically a poll that jumps up on screen, and we'll give you some instructions at that point. It's very straightforward. And just to let you know, a few acronyms we'll be using regularly today, and particularly for anyone from joining us from abroad. When myself or our panelists say FET today or FET, we're referring to further education and training, which many of you have a different title for in other countries or slightly different setups there. So usually I think vocational education and training is a common one, as it's called in other countries, or VET. So just to let you know that that's what we're referring to. The other note is of an acronym that we'll be using regularly today is UDL, which stands for Universal Design for Learning. I'm conscious that some of you in the room may not know a huge amount about what UDL is. And I suppose to sum it up in a sentence or two, UDL is a framework for inclusive design and teaching and learning practices that aims to proactively consider the needs of the huge variety of learners in our classrooms as much as is possible and intentionally design programs accordingly. So it's all about reducing barriers to learning in the classroom. If you want to find out more about that, I urge you after the session today to check out ahead.ie/UDL, and as well to go back to the week 2 videos of this conference where you can see what UDL actually looks like in practice. So before you start, I'd like to just fill you in a little bit on two important surveys that AHEAD has released the results from this week in relation to the impact of COVID-19, which I think you might be interested in. So one is a FET and higher education learner survey, and the other is a FET practitioner survey. So one is cross-tertiary and one is specifically about FET practitioners. Both are quite detailed and have lots of interesting findings about how learners with disabilities and FET practitioners are adapting to the new situation and some of the challenges really that they're facing, I suppose. So I urge you to check them out on our website. Just to give you a few key findings just to pique your interest. With the learner survey, we had 601 students with disabilities responding to the survey, and that's 25 out of 26 counties represented in terms of where those students are residing and participating in both FET and HE programs. And the survey was carried out relatively recently between April 9th and 27th. More than half of the respondents disagreed or strongly disagreed with the statement, "I am coping well with learning from home." So we know that there's a lot of students still really struggling out there, despite the great efforts that are going on in both HE and FET to keep those students engaged. Interestingly, students in FET programs were actually significantly more likely to agree with the statement that they, in other words, to say that they were coping well with learning from home than students in higher education, actually about twice as likely to say that they were coping well from home. So students who have the highest percentage of negative reaction to that statement are those in the mental health condition, and that's followed then by those with ADD, ADHD, and those with a specific learning difficulty. But I think really those with a mental health condition are really struggling, in particular with that lack of access to the counselling services and the lack of structure to the day that maybe is is part of their routine, and when that routine is disturbed, it's very difficult for those students. Some of the major issues raised definitely a lack of structure and motivation to continue learning, lack of clarity about where the students stand with regards to assessment and with regards to the reasonable accommodations they receive both in their learning and within those assessments, and issues around accessibility of the online materials that they're receiving as well from lecturers in the move to remote delivery. For the FET practitioner survey, we had 281 FET practitioners from 25 of the 26 FET program types, with representation from practitioners in all ETBs and at all levels, so non-accredited and QQI levels 1 to 6, all represented in the responses. And the survey was carried out over the same period, so relatively recently, and 23% of respondents said that they usually have allocated hours for supporting learners with disabilities. So that's, in other words, they're some kind of SEN teacher. The high volume there is probably likely due to AHEAD's connections with SEN teachers. But of that group, 44% said that they actually had been unable to cooperate that role remotely, and that's really concerning, I think, going forward, and something that we need to examine a bit further. And there was a range of reasons provided for why that might be. 68% said that they considered how learners with disabilities will interact with materials online in the move to remote teaching. So more than 2/3 have said they've made that consideration, even in the sort of the quick and emergency circumstances of the situation. And many actually who did react positively to that said that they mentioned actually the UDL approaches within there. So I'm glad that we're talking about it here today too. The report highlights actually the extraordinary commitment of the practitioners in their efforts to maintain student engagement. That's been a real highlight of looking at the report, seeing people using mixed methods to continue that engagement in terms of trying to reach out by phone, by text, using WhatsApp, using postal methods, as well as the online part of that delivery. So they're actually using a lot of sort of UDL approaches there, and that they're using mixed methods to reach out and engage. A lot of them as well are undertaken on social hours to maintain contact with their students in the evenings and over weekends, and a lot of one-to-one personal contact as well. But despite all that, there are serious concerns over continuing learner engagement. So 62% of the practitioners were aware of learners who were no longer able to engage in their learning remotely due to their home setup or situation. And on average, practitioners are rating the level of continued engagement of their learners at around 5 out of 10, 10 being kind of highly engaged. And within there, like some of the comments, for example, I think one person rated it as 5 out of 10 said, half of my learners are not continuing at this stage, and that's why it's 5 out of 10. So there's definitely a lot of learner disengagement, and that's something that we really need to address, I think, in FET as a sector as a whole. Trevor, I'm just wondering, what did you have any reflections on the results of the survey yourself as they came out?
Yeah, well, there was a few things that kind of, for me, as someone who's kind of worked in education, kind of stood out. And again, you just mentioned it, the one about how students, particularly with mental health conditions, ADHD or specific learning difficulty, seem to be finding it the most difficult to cope. And then what I thought that kind of feeds into the next piece, because of the issues about like clarity, structure, which would affect like the motivation of these kinds of students. So I think some of it, is kind of logical when you start seeing it. And that's what I like about the report, is that you can see the impact the COVID has on this, I mean, it came from like nowhere, the urge to, teach and learn online. And this is like, I suppose in some ways, some people won't be surprised, but for other people, this might illuminate kind of thoughts or what they suspected. So that's what I like about these stats. I think they kind of take away any kind of mystery around what's going on out there as well. And because they're so like recent, like literally they're just
Mm.
hot off the press as well. So I think they really
Yeah,
capture a moment.
yeah, and I think one of the things for me is that like a lot of these things we instinctively know are happening, but actually one of the things that's really stood out for me in the learner survey is the actual testimony of the students bringing home some of the really really difficult situations people are in now. And we talk about not putting people into kind of pigeonholing people into boxes with regards to say students with disabilities or students from other maybe disadvantaged groups. Just the range of issues that individuals are facing on multiple different kind of fronts is, it's a real eye opener, and I suppose it highlights how flexibility is really really important at this stage of the journey.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And even just those challenges at home about sharing laptops and,
Mm,
lots of people being at home, parents working from home or mature students working from home, and then having children in the house. Like it's,
absolutely, yeah,
you know,
absolutely. Listen, thanks, Trevor. I might ask you to mute yourself and dive into the chat box to begin your engagement with people in there, and we'll catch up with you a little bit later. So I think it's time to fully get started with today's session. So if Mary and Patricia could just unmute yourselves and begin to get ready to share there, that would be great. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our first contributors to the session today. As I said, my former colleague, head colleague Mary Quirk, and Dr. Patricia McCarthy, and they're going to talk about some of the key concepts that they have identified which need to be considered in the implementation of UDL for FET. So first, just to say, I'm going to give a little background to the UDL for FET project, which is an AHEAD project. So SULIS and ETBI have commissioned the AHEAD to undertake this project. And SULIS, I believe, see UDL as a very important tool in helping them to achieve their active inclusion goals more generally. There are two major outputs from the project. The first is the conceptual framework you're going to hear about from Mary and Patricia today. And that's a really important kind of scoping document which outlines from the literature some key concepts which need to be considered in the implementation of UDL for FET. That was launched by Andrew Brownlee, CEO of SULIS, in week one of this conference last month. That document is now helping to inform the development of the UDL for effect guidelines within AHEAD. So those guidelines really aimed at supporting practitioners to implement the UDL in their own setting. We've worked really hard in the development process of those guidelines to engage with the breadth of FETs, the breadth of the FET sector, to try and ensure that these are very much kind of guidelines of the sector for the sector. So as an example, we've conducted site visits of 7 different centre types across Ireland to engage with both management and practitioners about their current inclusive practices, their understanding of UDL, and what they feel they would want and need from UDL guidelines. We hosted a National World Cafe consultation event last October to gather more ideas from practitioners on the ground and from key stakeholders in the sector. And we've conducted countless individual practitioner interviews arising from the contacts that we built up at that event and throughout our journeys of consultation. So we did that really to capture good practice across different types of programs. So the aim really is that the guidelines really reflect the diversity of programs and the practitioners that make up FET and seek to build on the great practice that's already out there, because we know there's a rich history of inclusive practice in FET already. So helping to advise us on all strands of this project are the UDL for FET National Advisory Committee, which has representatives from key stakeholder bodies like SULIS and ETBI themselves, but also bodies like the National Disability Authority, like QQI, the National Centre for Guidance and Education, and many, many more. The list is too long to name here, but I'd like to thank each and every one of those members of the committee because they've been vital in developing this work. They really have. And we are looking forward to getting their input shortly again on the next phase of the project, the guidelines phase of the project. So before I hand you over to Mary and Patricia to talk about the framework itself, just I suppose a final thanks to SULIS and in particular to Roisin, Avicha and Jenny in the active inclusion team. They've just been wonderful collaborators and a wonderful support to us in this project as well. So how are you guys doing? Mary and Patricia, are you well?
Very good, thank you, Dara.
How
I'm
are you,
fine
Patricia?
too.
How are
I'm
you? How,
fine.
How are you surviving in the current madness of the climate we live in?
Well, I'm very fortunate to have my guide dog Gaston here to keep me company. So if people hear him panting in the background, it's just that he's come back from a nice long run.
And has Gaston made an appearance on Zoom yet in any of your sessions?
Absolutely, regularly.
And how are you, Mary?
Yes, I'm also doing very well, very busy. Could sell 2 teenagers and 2 dogs at this stage, but you know, I'll do a trade with Patricia. I'll take Gaston, she can have the teenagers.
Okay, guys, listen, I'm going to let you get started and crack on, and we'll see you afterwards for a few questions.
Great. Thank you. I'm just going to introduce and hand over to Patricia first. I'd like to welcome everybody and say that it's great to interact with you all on this forum, and thank you very much for the opportunity for to engage with our presentation. Our presentation is entitled "Let's Make Inclusion Everyone's Business," which is a phrase that I have to say that Patricia coined up over one of the many cups of coffees we had while we were writing up the framework for FET, and very much trying to get to the bottom of, well, what is it we want to offer the FET sector as a framework as they engage with an increasing diversity of students, while they've always been engaged with an increased diversity of students. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass you over to Dr. Patricia McCarthy.
Thanks, Mary, and thank you all for attending today. I suppose we'll start by saying the problem is, you know, where does learning start and stop within, you know, the whole system? And I suppose the solution that we're sort of looking at today is, you know, creating a shared understanding of UDL, both inside and outside of the classroom. And I suppose it's that thinking about it that we're really going to discuss today. And I suppose we also need to recognize that we need to appreciate that I and we all are part of, you know, the solution and therefore the who of learning. You might move to the next slide. Thanks, Mary. I suppose, you know, everyone appreciates that UDL is a good idea. I suppose some people are implementing UDL with great intent. Others would say, you know, they're implementing it unintentionally. Some people really don't even know where to start with it. And others, you know, would appreciate knowing a bit more about it. And I suppose those are some of the issues that became relevant for us as we worked through this report, this publication. Thanks, Mary. Okay, we all recognise that Ireland has been recognised for its love of learning, and we have been known for a long time about as the country of saints and scholars. However, when it comes to the education of people with disability, I suppose for a long time it was perceived that we weren't educable at all and therefore weren't ever considered within the education system. And then I suppose it moved to a situation where we were being educated, and we were being educated within special education systems which were separate from the mainstream and the regular classrooms. Now, I suppose you could argue that, you know, this was inclusion of a kind, and, you know, there was education being provided. It may not have been in the right location, but it was there. And I suppose the problem with some of this was that, you know, the assumptions around the abilities of people with disabilities was often seen that we weren't capable as our peers were. And I suppose that is a legacy of the special education system in many ways. You might move on, please, Mary. Thank you. Okay. You're all probably wondering why Crocodile Rock by Elton John is written up here. I suppose I'm going to begin by giving you a flavour of there's going to be stories discussed throughout this presentation, and the reason for this is that really when it comes to inclusion and inclusive practices and changing in legislation, you know, it is the voices of those that have been marginalised who have been very influential in this. And I suppose to begin with, myself and Mary grew up, well, we were born very close to each other in Cork, which many of you will, or some of you will know, at a very similar time. However, our experience of education was very different. And, you know, to begin with, I suppose mine was segregationist, it was institutionalized, it happened over 250 kilometers from my family, you know. However, I suppose I was fortunate in a way that I was amongst the first cohort to sit state examinations. And I suppose within about 15 years after leaving education, compulsory education, I undertook a degree, and you know, 15 years plus after that, I graduated with a doctorate from Trinity College. I suppose my reasons for giving some of this information is that this has allowed me the opportunity to advocate at a national systemic level for the, you know, around issues that are pertinent to the experiences of disabled people. Now, I'm going to offer Mary the opportunity just to give a brief contrasting story of her.
Thank you, Patricia. Yes, I think just to share it, while Patricia and I would, and we didn't know each other, by the way, pretty much until we came, and didn't know each other quite so well till we came to work together and do this research very closely together. But it was striking that we grew up very close to each other, and Patricia should actually have been in primary school with me while she wasn't. And I went through the primary school system and the secondary school system and had never any doubt but that I was going to be engaged in state exams, and would proceed to university and nurse training straight after leaving cert. It's basically to make the point, and it struck both of us as we worked together, and I'm now working with Patricia again years later, and it took us a longer, or it took her, Patricia certainly longer than it would have others to get to our destination, but inclusion is something that we just can't take for granted. And that's the first key point that we really wanted to get across in this presentation, that there's at all stages people thought that they were being inclusive, even back when Patricia was in school, as Patricia has shared with me, but we cannot take inclusion for granted. Thank you, Patricia. I'll pass back to you. Okay,
thank you. The next slide, I suppose, just gives a glimpse in images of some of my life experiences. You can see my graduation there with my nephew, just in case somebody is wondering who the young man is. I'm just going to draw your attention, I suppose, to one image there. You can see a machine on the top of one of the images, and that's a Braille machine, and that's how I was educated. It was through the medium of Braille. Now I use technology, and you can see that on another one. And I suppose we just showed this to show that, you know, now I am engaging in a very proactive and, you know, worthwhile way with many aspects of education. And I suppose we posed the question, if UDL was in place when I was a child, how would my education experience be different from what it actually was? Next slide, please, Mary. Thank you. Okay, so just to, I suppose, to remind people again, and I suppose I'm doing this to set the scene for why, you know, it is so important that UDL is considered and the importance of it. Restructuring of the education system in Ireland only began in the 1990s, and this led to, you know, changes within special education, and, you know, enhanced the importance of inclusive education. And this is very apparent now in legislation and, you know, a lot of policy initiatives. I suppose the next slide, and this, you know, these changes were definitely influenced by the social model of disability, and some of you may know about the social model, which, you know, emphasizes that actually it's society imposes the barriers on people with disabilities rather than the person with the disability having the problem. The next two slides are going to just show you very short excerpts from four of the participants who participated in my PhD research, which looked at the education experiences and transition opportunities of blind and vision impaired people in Ireland. And I suppose the first one there from John shows that he went through the special education system, and he would say that it was purely because he needed to learn Braille and that wasn't available to him within regular schools. By contrast to that, Alan, who would have gone through the system, you know, a decade or maybe even 2 decades later, had a very different experience, and he was in mainstream regular schools in his own locality, and you know, the teachers were very accommodating and provided the material in a manner that he could work with. You might just go to the next slide, please, Mary. Thank you. I suppose these are just two more, and you know, it's this sort of thing then and now, and the expectations, you know, around what blind and vision impaired people were and are capable of doing. Maria, who would have been of a similar age to myself, you know, and went through the special education system, you know, her mother was told that she wouldn't need Irish or maths because the work that she would be engaged in, you know, wouldn't require those sort of subjects. So that also meant that they had no expectation for Maria going on to university. By contrast, Paul, who was in my youngest age cohort, his biggest problem, really, he perceived anyway, was that he had too many choices, which was wonderful to see. And I have to say, he was a very enthusiastic young man and went on to university and has achieved at a very high rate. You know, and I suppose that's just to give you a flavor of some of the stories in synopsis form that I was hearing about. Now, I suppose really, you know, we've been talking about inclusion, and increasingly we realize the importance of inclusion and how that is now, you know, even today, it's even more important. And when you think about it, you know, COVID-19 has shifted the emphasis, I believe, around inclusion in many ways, because it's not just the individual with a disability that has to be included. Now, I would imagine that there are lots of people out there who are even lecturing or teaching in different capacities who suddenly went, oh, how am I going to be included in this very new world? So I suppose it's timely to look at how UDL can contribute to this. You know, it's valuable, and, you know, I'm going to let Mary talk a bit more about that in a while. Again, back to this inclusion and inclusiveness, we have to keep remembering that inclusion is never done. If we think that we have reached full inclusion at any point, I believe we have lost the battle, because we always have to change and we're always having to adapt to new situations. It's equitable. We have, you know, considered a lot of the legislation, and I'm not going to go into it now, but, you know, inclusion is paramount and is, you know, upfront and in all of the new legislation over the last 20 years. And I suppose UDL can be responsive and can really make such a difference, you know, within further education and training, and, you know, within all aspects of education. And, you know, it's very important within the SOLAS strategy and within the active inclusion agenda. Next slide, please, Mary. Okay, this is where I'm going to hand over to Mary.
Thank you, Patricia. I suppose Patricia has looked a little bit at the past and the experience of learners, and for a lot of people in education, and particularly with our engagement with our colleagues in the further education and training sector, and I would have had previous engagement many years ago, it's the learner and the people's stories that make it real, and it's always those people that drive it on. There's been expanding post-compulsory education opportunities for students with disabilities as a priority nationally and internationally, continually year on year. And in Ireland, as Patricia said already, that the legislation is underpinning the policy of inclusion. So this is kind of a little bit of the, I suppose, the kind of what we should be doing. And we also know that the numbers from a heads participation rate have continued to increase year on year. So unlike maybe a decade ago, there is more and more students seeking to engage in the further education and training system and move on to higher education and training, or even indeed go to work, or sometimes come back the other way either. So it was very timely that we were engaged in this national project in looking at the what a framework for universal design for learning for the further education and training sector in Ireland. And the part that Patricia and I very much looked at was the thinking. What was the basis for what maybe would roll out in the future? And as Dara has said there at the beginning, there is going to be some guidelines that are going to come to support this documentation. So the first thing what we want to look at was, well, who are we talking about? We knew it was about the learner. Inclusion has been a drum that's been banged for many, many years. And I suppose we need to really always stop and appreciate who are the people that want to be included. And the further education and training sector is a multidisciplinary collaborative environment. There's community education, there's apprenticeships, there's employers. It's not just a teacher in a classroom coming from a pedagogical basis. And that was the first thing that we needed to stop and think about. It's not that anyone was necessarily different, but all of these practitioners themselves needed to be included in the very framework. So we basically set about saying, well, inclusion and appreciating inclusion has to be everybody's business. It's a little bit like the COVID hand washing, as I was discussing with Patricia when we were preparing for the presentation. It's not just good enough that one or two might do it, we all have to do it. Also, it's not enough that we might just do it once, we have to keep doing it with intent. So with that in mind, we basically thought, well, what is the research telling us about literature? I mean, coming from the field of practice and policy myself, I know exactly what people are saying out there and what they're doing, and there's fantastic work being done. But what are they actually, what have the researchers been saying? And UDL is Universal Design and Universal Design for Learning is pretty new when you look at the whole models of disability and the inclusive landscape. Ronald Mace, an architect, basically came up with the whole concept of designing for a universally diverse population back in the 1950s, and he was first writing in the 1970s, and it was pretty much looking at design principles around buildings and products. That shifted into the learning environment and was very much taken up I suppose in a number of different frameworks in how curriculum and pedagogy and assessment could be modified. But it was very much just looking at it within the context of a classroom, while there has been other applications in other environments. Then we started to realize that there is a design thinking for learning, that it was almost beginning to flip a little bit, that it was not as if you had to start again, but you had to look at what you were doing through a universally designed lens and ask, how can it be more inclusive? How do I need to change it? A little bit like this webinar that we're actually engaged with today. The other place that we were finding there was where we could join the dots with the literature was that you had to think UD for inclusion and active inclusion, and equally you had to think about inclusion if you were going to think about universal design. If you were thinking of including the most people possible, well, then you had to start thinking about inclusion in and of itself. We very much explored universal design in education, and particularly in post-secondary education and community post-secondary education environments across the world. Very little UDL there. An awful lot of the UDL that we were coming across at the time was more at second level education or in higher education. Another thing that came across, whether it was UD in the education environment or whether it was UD in the architectural or product design environment, is that it is in and of itself an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach. It takes a lot of heads to come around the table and sit around and say, well, okay, how are we going to look at this? How are we going to design this? How can we pull this together? So there was quite an extensive literature review done, and we actually did engage with librarians, etc. And we wanted to look at not just the discourse, but we also wanted to very much look at the philosophy and the very core and the seed that started it all. by way of example, we came across 7 different models of universal design in the learning environment. And it was very interesting to even explore those. And we wanted to pull, I suppose, what we felt would be the most common themes and themes that would be applicable for the FET sector in Ireland. So as we've said, and I'm not going to go back over it again, was the first step was we recognised was that you needed to appreciate inclusion. And that means you're appreciating your learner, you're appreciating their story, you're appreciating why they want to be included, and you're appreciating that whatever you're doing at the very bottom of the triangle, that is the universal triangle, is going to be designed for the majority of your students, irrespective of who they are or where they're coming from. It's as you move up the triangle that you might start to group the accommodations. And universal design isn't fixed, it isn't a static thing, and it is not something that will ever negate the need for add-on accommodations. Somebody might not need it one day, but they might need it the next. People change and things change, as we certainly can appreciate in the current situation. One thing that I like to say to people about UD and how it evolves all the time, it's a little bit like COVID. It's not just enough that you washed your hands 6 weeks ago when you were told. You actually have to keep washing them, irrespective of where they are. So you're always back at the beginning. With respect to the application of UDL, that's Universal Design for Learning, or UD in the learning environment, we very much, I suppose, leaned towards the CASTS model of learning. And I have the 3 pillars up there on the screen in front of you. The first being the multiple means of engagement, where they look at how you motivate and have sustained enthusiasm for learning, using and thinking about the materials that you're using and ensuring that they're accessible to people. Where you're thinking about how you're presenting your information and the multiple means of representation. And then the multiple means of action and expression would be a nod towards assessment, where students are demonstrating their learning. Then the other piece that we needed to, in conjunction with that, was appreciate that whether you were an instructor, a teacher, or an employer, even out there engaged with an apprentice, that what would be a common theme or something that you could bring to this whole pedagogical approach to universal design. And we found commonality in terms of 4 areas. Appreciation, that you could appreciate that you had something to offer, and that you also could teach or inspire or engage with a learner, and you could appreciate what it was to have to engage with the inclusion paradigm. You could accept that you might need to change, or accept that you might need to do things a little bit differently, that you would very much strive to include intentionally. And intentional is the 4th pillar there, that it wasn't something that just happened, but you thought about it, it was considered, and sometimes you had to rethink about it. And that you would appreciate, while there was a community of learning and you were part of a community of learning in FET, that everybody was coming with a different point of view, which is why it very much lent itself to the who and to that personal responsibility side. The theoretical framework of FET had to embrace the diversity of experience within the FET system. There is a wide range of professionals, and that's the beauty of FET, is the fact that it has so much experience in there to offer the learner, but each cannot work in a silo. They cannot work on their own. They have to be part of this community of learning. And the very framework needs to respect their input, and they also need to respect their input, because equally, while they're part of a silo, they also have to each take individual responsibility for their contribution to that community, which leads very much on to, and I suppose this was the big piece, is that appreciating who you are in terms of that multidisciplinary network, that you have to very much take on the UDL mantra with intent. And this again, it's very easy to pick on COVID at the moment for perfect examples for this. But you know, there's so many things out there we all have to do as a community, but we still have to come inside our front door and take our individual responsibility. UDL is pretty much the same thing. I had thought a couple of weeks ago I would be attending the head seminar with Patricia and engaging with all you colleagues and having a lovely catch up. And here I am online with my fingers crossed the dogs won't go mad any minute. But I have to take responsibility, and I have to consider how I'm delivering my message. So those 4 key things, appreciation, acceptance, inclusion, intentionality, were so important for us supporting the community of practitioners, but also you as an individual practitioner as you go support that learner. And I think that's very important. So yes, there is the triangle of universal design. And the idea would be that, I suppose, the more of us that take it on, the more people will be included from the get-go, and the less need there will be add-on sports. It's a little bit like the COVID surge. The less of us that take it on, the greater need there might be for add-on supports. So we all have to play our part on that team. So with that in mind, we thought we'd introduce 3 good habits for UDL going forward so that we could make it everybody's business. The first habit is that start to think about UDL inputs as about we, not me. This is a collaboration. This is about working together with the learner, with our colleagues, with the team. It's all of us in this community of learning practice together. The second habit is to commit to rethinking your engagement, recognizing everyone as a UDL expertise. We're always starting. Everyone, every day is always starting at the beginning because it's always evolving. People are always evolving. Those people who feel or believe or think that they might be excluded tomorrow might have been included today. It continuously evolves. What we're training in, what people are taking exams and how they're being assessed, how they're learning. You have to commit to rethinking your engagement. It's not like I've sorted that out now. Last year, it's done. We're home and dry. And the third habit is to try and try again. And this is probably the challenge because it is the trying that transforms the experience. You constantly have to think it. It's a way of thinking and it's a way of experiencing. The third habit cannot conflict with the first or second. In other words, just because you adopt one habit doesn't mean you can drop the other 2. You actually have to keep each habit going all the time. Might sound a little complicated, but believe it or not, we're doing it in our day-to-day lives at the moment within this pandemic. So it's not really that complicated either. Have you anything to say, Patricia, as we wrap up?
Actually,
No, I think,
just as you're wrapping up there, guys, what I might do is just launch a wee poll actually about take a wee look at, are people applying UDL as a habit within the group? So I'm just going to launch that poll as you wrap up, and if the audience could just answer that poll, we might just have a wee chat about it afterwards.
Yeah, that's great. I suppose really it's, for me, that last one, the try and try again, is probably often the most challenging thing to do because it can, it can be difficult, but really it is that thing, again, as I said, it's around recognizing that inclusion is never done. And we always are trying to include somebody else to ensure that nobody, or as far as possible, people don't feel excluded.
I love that concept because I'm a firm believer that it's almost a harsh thing to say, but I'm a firm believer that we'll look back in 10 years at what we're doing now and, be horrified at certain parts of what we're doing. I think that's the whole point of this thing, that we have to be like, we haven't done our job in 10 years time if we aren't looking back at some of the current practice and going, oh my God, we thought that was what we looked at as acceptable inclusion, So I don't know how you feel about that, but I certainly look back since the time I began ahead 12 years ago, and the landscape looks very, very different already. We've come such a long way. And I remember when we joined being so impressed by some of the work that was being going on then. And, so it is this ever evolving journey that we need to continue on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm just looking at some of the polling that's coming in here. I'm just going to hopefully share these results here, but I can start to fill you in on what it is. So 27% have said they're not applying UDL as a habit yet. They don't know enough and they're just getting started. About 60% said I'm on my UDL journey, still learning, but I'm doing a lot. And I love to know there's 14% of the room are UDL pros, and see it as part of their everyday thinking and just the way they think about education. I think that's quite encouraging, isn't it?
Mm.
Yeah, I actually like to think that the 60% are the interesting people for me, that they feel they're on the journey and they have more to learn.
And I think that's
I would say we might have all more to learn.
Yeah, with UDL, I think you have that curve, Jen, when you think you're really fully understanding it, and then you go into a sort of dip again, you realize you have a lot to learn. I think that's everyone's kind of journey arc with this thing. So
yeah, and a nod to the 27%. It is in the habits, because even at the moment and in the last week, Sarah, when we engaged with you with the webinar and putting this up as a webinar and we had to rethink our engagement, you are constantly thinking about how you can be included and how you can include. It's like a two-way lens. Absolutely. So I would say to them that they're nearly in the better space, because it can be very challenging to drop old habits.
And can I just give one example there of how Dara had to be inclusive today for me, because I've watched some of the other webinars, and rightly so, he's intervened at times throughout the presentation to pose questions or to make comments, and I specifically asked that he wouldn't do it while I was presenting, so that I wouldn't lose my trail of thought. So I do appreciate that today, Dara. I'm sure you were probably sitting on your...
Not at all, not at all. Listen, that's part of what we do, and I hope everybody does a little bit of that. You know, is about, it's all about asking people what they want and what they need, and letting them drive the conversation. Listen, Carrie, if I could ask you to begin to unmute yourself, I just want to say thanks so much, guys. That's really given me lots of food for thought, and the work you did on the framework is really exceptional. And it's actually, particularly that concept of the who has really grasped my attention in sort of flipping it, I suppose. From, we talk a lot about the learner-centric, you know, we have to be learner-centered, everything has to be focused towards the learners, but to do that we actually need to have a framework that works for our practitioners as well. I think that flipping of that ideology there really has stuck with me and has been really informative for us in how we are developing those guidelines. So
keep
thank you.
washing your hands.
Keep washing my hands, indeed. Carrie, if you could begin to share your screen. Listen, thank you very much, Mary and Patricia. That was wonderful. If you guys could just mute yourselves, that would be fantastic.
Thanks, Dara.
How are you, Carrie?
All good here, Dara. Thank you very much. How are things there?
Not too bad, thank you. I'm just going to mute your video, Carrie, because your audio is a little bit
perfect.
crackly. Great. So
perfect.
I'll let you get on with it, Carrie. We're running a little bit behind, so I'll let you get on with your business, and we'll have a chat afterwards, maybe.
Yeah, no bother. Thanks a million, Dara. So, so the theme that I'm going to speak to today is that of it takes a village. So what we're going to do is I'm going to have a look at a professional learning network that we run in the City of Dublin Education and Training Board for support teachers. So we had picked this idea of being curiouser and curiouser because we found that being part of a network of other teachers has made us question everything that we're doing. And that's kind of the whole idea then, is the whole idea that we're sharing curiosities. So the first thing that we're going to do is to meet the villagers. You'll notice that there's just me here today, but in our original presentation that we were going to do at the AHEAD conference, there's myself, Dr. Stephen O'Neill from the CTETB Psychological Service, and then Denise O'Connor from a media teacher from Coláiste Dúlaigh College of Further Education. We're supposed to be doing this presentation together, so I'm hoping that I'll be able to speak to them. So just a little bit about myself. So I have been working in the City of Dublin Education and Training Board for 10 years. And originally I came in as a beauty and complementary therapy teacher, and more recently moved into a student support role working in a PLC college, where I was coordinating the support services for all of the students who were in Back to Education initiative or who were in our PLC programs. And a week before COVID sent us all home, I was appointed on a secondment as the Professional Development Coordinator for the CTETB. But part of my role over the past 2 years has been that I've facilitated this professional learning network for our PLC support teachers. One of the reasons I've been so interested and I suppose such a huge advocate for inclusion for UDL and for looking at the whole idea of student support in our sector is my own daughter is an early school leaver and she's ADHD, so she's 21 now, but she was out of school very, very early and has found it very difficult to re-engage. So I'm constantly trying to look at and find ways that she would have been able to engage with materials, with classes, with assessments, with loads of different things. So the next one of our villagers that we've got here is Dr. Stephen O'Neill. So Stephen is with the Psychological Service. And the Psychological Service are the ones that support this particular professional network. So they have support consultative groups that meet on a monthly basis for post-primary guidance counsellors and for post-primary special ed teachers. And then they also have that in place for guidance counsellors in further education. But there was this huge gap where in PLC colleges, despite the fact that there were loads of teachers working in support, there was no space for them to come together to meet and to share those curiosities that we've been talking about. And then, as I said, Denise is a media teacher. Denise joined our professional learning network this year. Denise came to us because she had started to work in the area of student support this year, but has absolutely no training in the area, but also noticed that the number of learners in her class group with additional learning needs, most especially neurodiverse learners, was increasing hugely year on year. And she wanted to have somewhere where she could go to be able to throw ideas around with people and to make sure that what she was doing was best practice. So just to give a little bit of context, I suppose both to our national and international listeners here, the City of Dublin Education and Training Board provides education in so many diverse settings. So we've got our colleges of further education, which would be known as post-leaving certificate colleges, where we might also provide services for students returning to education and in different programs as well. And then we've got youth reach centres, which are typically for early school leavers between the ages of 16 and 21. We've adult education services, education to prisons, training centres, community training centres, local training initiatives and specialist training. So you can see that there's a huge cohort of students that we provide for. But that also means that we've got a really, really diverse group of teachers that are working, or trainers or tutors that are working within each of these different areas. But the focus today for our PLN is on the post-leaving certificate. So that's what we're going to look at. So we've got this idea, we've got the Cheshire cat here saying that my reality is just different from yours. And I think that that's really important for us to examine, is the fact that the PLC sector, or this idea of doing a post-certificate leaving cert course, it's a very, very different experience. The courses are so short. The students begin in September, they're out again by May. And within that, if we have a student coming in who has any additional learning needs, it's a really, really quick turnaround time for us to, first of all, have the student coming in and then going through the orientation or the induction process, being able to do a holistic needs assessment, being able to build a profile, being able to share that with their teachers in an agreed way, and then to start to put support services in place for that student to be able to reach their needs. They could have an assignment within the first 6 weeks of all of that, and then we start all of that again in September. So for teachers working in the area of support, that can be a real challenge. The next thing is then that the reality being different from yours is that what's happening in my college is completely different than what's happening in another. So the way that student supports are provided for in one PLC college is very, very different across all of the PLC colleges that we have. And some of our colleges have a disability support service, which is supported by the National Learning Network, and others don't. So kind of having this space makes it very, very different and very diverse. And the learners that are working in each of the different centres or coming to each of the different colleges are coming in to study really, really diverse and very different courses as well. So the idea was, like I said, we already had those different consultative groups that were put together for the guidance counsellors, but nothing for us. So Caroline Martin, who's the chief psychologist in the City of Dublin Education and Training Board, I had plagued Caroline because when I was doing my master's, I was really interested, or could see the idea of wanting to do workshops for teachers working with learners or working with students, and have been able to create a visibility around LGBTQI students. So I had already struck up a relationship with Caroline. And when they needed somebody to start to facilitate or coordinate a network for our support teachers, she contacted me because she knew I had trained in special education, and then I took over and started to run this particular PLN. So basically what happens is, on a monthly basis, you'll see here we've got Alice at the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. So once a month, in different colleges across the CDETB, we hold a professional learning network meeting, which lasts for 2 hours. We come together over a cup of tea, where we all sit together. We meet on different days each month to try to facilitate teachers not having to miss the same classes or not having to have them released from the same groups every single time. And by going into each other's colleges, it gives us an opportunity to meet with different principals. It means that different teachers get to be able to come at different stages. And we also get an opportunity just to reach out and to sit around and to share things with each other. What we found was, you'll see here that we've got Alice, and she is going down the rabbit hole. The teacups, the roses, the cards are flying. We've got that countdown watch as well, that, you know, when we got together and we started to speak, we could see that we were all in very, very different circumstances. So for example, I, as a beauty teacher, and that's where my training or my expertise was, even though I was trained in special education, I can have students coming to me for support who are working on a graphic design course. Now, I have absolutely no experience and no knowledge of any of the Adobe packages. So things can feel like you're just spiraling and spiraling and spiraling if you don't have somebody else that you're able to bounce your ideas off or share with or share with. And if you're doing that on your own, you'll see here that the Mad Hatter is saying it could be impossible. Or Alice is saying that it's impossible, but the Mad Hatter is encouraging her and saying, you know, it's only impossible if you believe that it is. And that's why we want teachers or support teachers to come together, because individually you're questioning yourself constantly as if you're doing the right thing. So when we come together, what we're doing is we've got the signposts here asking, is it this way, is it that way, you know, what way should I go, or should I go back? So using the space of these meetings meant that we were able to share our curiosities, and we use a model called the ORID model, where it's a focused conversation where we're going through, looking at things objectively, then reflectively, we're interpreting, and then we're making decisions. So this particular slide here says, I knew who I was this morning, but I've changed a few times since that. And when we come into these meetings, we think we're in one space, but by the time we're going out, we're in a completely different one. And this is where I'm going to channel my inner Stephen O'Neill. So this is kind of this is the science piece and the model that's used in all of the consultative groups, and that we use as well in our professional learning network. So here you've got Kolb's experiential learning cycle, and our cup of coffee and a couple of macaroons there at the side, because the coffee is very important in this situation. So we're going to start with looking at this idea of reflective observation. So when we come together, what we're doing is we're looking back at what we've been doing in our own centres, or with our own individual learners, or with a class group. And we're trying to assess that and look at what went well and what didn't go so well. In the next quadrant then, we discuss and try to make sense of the experiences that we had. So this was the abstract conceptualization. So we're trying to look at what it was. We critically discuss it and we're reflecting on it. We're trying to look at what went well. And if something went really well for us, why did that go well? But if it didn't go well, why did that not go well? Was it something that somebody else could try out and that they could do and that they could use in their own centre? And it was looking at, you know, this conceptualization is, what does that mean for us? And also, what does it mean for other people? The next quadrant then is the active experimentation. So this is where we go back out into our own centres, and for the next month or over the next year, depending on what the thing is that we're putting in place, we're testing out our conclusions and we're coming up with a really conscious plan of action. So that can be either individually, again, or it can be a centre-based thing that we're doing. And then we've got the concrete experience in the final quadrant. So that's where we act on something, we try it out, it's something that we do, and it's an experience that we have. We try it and we come back in again, back into that quadrant where we've got the reflective observation, when we're all together and we're talking about it and we're teasing it out together. So some of the things that we have done is, for example, we created collectively, based on all of our own individual needs assessments that we were doing with our learners, we created a template for a needs assessment that would build up a holistic profile of the learners when they come into the colleges. Another thing that we did was, based on this experiential learning cycle, one of the key things that we were really having difficulty with as a group and within further education was working with neurodiverse learners. So we worked with Dr. Tish Balfe in DCU on developing a 2-day training session where Tish came in and she worked with all of the support teachers so that they could understand better ways to be able to work with learners with who were neurodiverse. And based on that, something, let's say, for example, Coláiste Dúlaigh are doing is this year they're running a specific course for neurodiverse learners in IT with a big focus on getting those learners into employment. But all of that came from the sessions that we'd been doing together. So here we've got, instead of you guys taking part in a Mentimeter, I'm going to show you our teachers in the Professional Learning Network completed a Mentimeter. And some of the questions that we asked them, so this very first one was that we asked our teachers what were some of the challenges of being part of a professional learning network. And I know from the research that AHEAD have just done that one of the key recommendations around supporting PhET practitioners is going to be having communities of practice or professional learning networks so that we can work together. But some of the challenges are the teachers were just too busy. So missing classes, time, having access or being able to travel to some of the centres, they were really, really big difficulties. Places where the teachers, you know, somebody said here that they didn't have any challenges because the principal backed it. The time constraints, again, missing students and prioritising. They were some of the biggest difficulties. And again, access to centres. And all of this was pre-COVID. So I think that definitely there is a space for us moving forward to be able to shift some of these things online. I still think face-to-face is important, but when time is such a huge issue, this is something that we need to look at when we develop our network. The next question that we asked, and there is a link to this Mentimeter in the PowerPoints that will have been put up as well. So the benefits of the PLN for individuals as professionals. Okay, so some of the key things that came back was the majority of the teachers in our network do not have any form of training or expertise in special education. So the idea of being able to expand an understanding of learners with special needs was really important. Creating links with other centres and people that you might not have met with before. They felt supported, that they're not alone. So they're not going down Alice's rabbit hole there of just not knowing what goes on. They felt less isolated, and then that idea of being able to experiment and becoming enlightened. And the idea of having a network of like-minded people and meeting support teachers from other colleges as well were really important on a professional level. The next thing we asked was, what are the benefits for you personally of being part of the PLN? So teachers, or our teachers had come back and said, hearing other people and other centres' difficulties gives you a sense that we're not alone. So we're back to that Mad Hatter's Tea Party where we're all sitting down and we all have a common purpose and we're all in this together. An opportunity to learn about other opportunities open to teachers and how to seek supports and funding towards solutions. So very often people didn't know what the funding options were. And we also had Eamon Macaulay, Programme Director in DCU School of Inclusive Education. He came in and spoke to us about training opportunities around doing a postgraduate diploma in special ed. So getting access to those kinds of things were really important. Feeling that together as a wider community we have a voice, and come away from those sessions feeling really positive. So that was another key point that came from it. And having it affirmed that what we're doing is actually really good practice. So this idea that sometimes we're trying out UDL and we don't even realise it. People were doing things and they didn't know why they were doing them, but they were good practice. So the next one was, has your participation in the network impact on your centre? So the teachers from College to Dulig said, yeah, because now they're able to specifically deliver a course for neurodiverse students. Somebody in an adult ed centre had said that it gave them an idea about what centres the learners might be able to go to after they finish on their programmes. So the PLN, we opened up to loads of other people if they wanted to come in and to attend any of our sessions. It was open to them to do as well. And they felt that it did because the new ideas that they had were going back to centres. So for example, one college had shared its idea around how they do a specific orientation programme, and other colleges have tried that out and it has proven really, really successful. And then about impacting on your students. So has your participation impacted on your students? So one teacher said, not yet, but the sharing of experiences may help in delivery of services in the future. Another said, yeah, especially those with ASD, because that has been one of our main focuses. And then someone else said that they feel that improvements in practice are a result of a number of different things. So participating in a network and talking locally with the colleagues that you have and reading into things and reading in other reports has been really important. So I think at the end of all of this, what's really important here is we've got an image of Alice and the Mad Hatter and saying, when you can't look on the bright side, I'll sit with you in the dark. So there have definitely been times and occasions where things have completely not gone well and teachers are feeling completely overwhelmed. And this is a really important supportive space that teachers can come to and they can feel supported. So this final part is, you know, the secret, Alice, is to surround yourself with people who make your heart smile, and it's then and only then you'll find Wonderland. I have had the huge benefit of working with really passionate, really dedicated, and really inclusive practitioners who are really trying hard to do their best. And I feel really supported that I found a tribe within this PLN, and it has definitely informed my practice, and I'm really, really grateful for it. So that's it. I'm done.
Thank you.
I'm going to
Thank you
stop
so much.
sharing.
I love that idea of a tribe, you know, an inclusion tribe that you're in there in CDE to be. I'm looking forward to seeing what your little tribe looks like when we all come together. And you have specific chants or things that you do as you arrive in. I suppose just I'm gonna ask you a question in a minute, just around maybe what would you see as
No
the
problem.
kind of enablers of a network like this, and potentially the kind of barriers to the sustainability of a network like this. Just as you're having to think about that, just somebody in the chat box had asked about when the next UDL course might come. I presume they're referring to a head's UDL badge, which I know Carrie is actually currently undertaken and is almost finished as part of her work. But we're just some initial ideas are to run the badge later on again this year. I'm not really in a position yet to frame up exact dates or things like that, but we're probably looking at September, October, and we're probably hoping to make that a sort of decent sized national run of the course, so that lots of people have opportunities to engage with it, because it is one of those opportunities again where people begin to connect as a community, because we do work in a sort of in groups within that course. So Carrie, just wondering then, do you have any reflections on maybe what are some of the challenges to sort of sustainability of a network like this, and also what you see as the key enablers? What is it that makes this network work?
Absolutely. So definitely this is going to be both a barrier and an enabler, and that's support from centre management. Being given the opportunity to be able to attend these sessions is really, really important, because it can sometimes be seen that in the short term you're missing classes, but the overall impact and the long-term impact that attending these sessions and sharing your practice has is huge. So that kind of idea of once a month missing 2 hours of classes in comparison to what you're able to bring back and share with your centre, you know, people need to really look at that and to weigh that up and to see how can that be facilitated. So definitely that's why one of the things we're going to have to look at as an organisation is, can we move that online so that teachers are missing less classes? And they don't have to travel across the city. You know, I suppose because we're inner city as well, it can be very, very difficult to get from one side of the city to the other at the times that we've had it. So that can be a barrier. But where teachers are really supported and encouraged to come to the meetings. That's a huge enabler.
Excellent. I think we have one more question. Carol, if you could
Sure.
begin to get yourself ready, Carol, to mute your video and audio and begin to share your screen just while we take this last question for Kerry, that would be great. So Lucia Venturi, apologies if I'm not pronouncing that right, Lucia, asks, how do you use the experiential learning cycle within the network?
Yeah, so it's just literally, none of these things are ever pointed out explicitly to anybody about what we're doing. It's something that just happens from, once somebody has shared what they're doing and a good practice, and again, it could have been around UDL. So they share something that they're doing, and then you go, do you know what, that would really work in my context. Then they just go back out and they just give it a go. And when we come back in again, they talk about whether or not they tried it. And one of the things that has been really important is that that's not necessarily within that month. So for example, like the orientation was something that had to wait a full year before you were able to implement or to try it out again. So something that somebody planned, then they gave it a go, and then they've come back, and over the course of the 2 years, they've discussed how that worked for them, and we've all reflected together on a way that we might try it differently. So for example, I was in the college that had tried out the orientation, and then another college tried it, but they did something completely different, and I took a piece of that and we put that in ours. So that's the way that experiential cycle works. And you don't get to share that or to try something else different unless you come back to the network and let us know how it got on.
That's really interesting. For anyone else who's interested out there in the whole concept of communities of practice and maybe some of the more theoretical aspects behind them, please do check out week 1 of the HEAD conference, where we had Dr. Etienne Wenger-Trainer, who's an international expert in the ideas of kind of social learning, and he has some really interesting ideas there as well about the enablers, the challengers, the key parts that need to be there, which are your kind of your grassroots energy and commitment, and also your kind of top-down support within that, and indeed a strong value proposition, which is I think something that your network really does have, as a strong value proposition. There's a really strong reason why people would want to engage with it. So I think it's fantastic work. Thank you so much, Kerry, and if you wouldn't mind.
No bother. Thanks for having me.
Just muting down yourself as you go. That's brilliant. Carol, listen, if you could share your slides there as we say hello. Firstly, how are you doing?
I think I'm okay, thanks. How about yourself?
Not too bad. Where are you broadcasting from?
I'm broadcasting from the sunny south, Cork.
Magnificent, and it's good to see you again. I was actually involved in mildly involved in a project called the Active Inclusion Network with Carol many years ago. So I'm hoping the project might get a shout out here even today. But I'm really looking forward to understanding.
And less of the mild, Dara.
And I'm really looking forward to hearing what the Jabberwocky of inclusion is all about. So I'm going to head over to you.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Carol. I'm talking to you on behalf of the Cork Education and Training Board. I'm here to speak a bit like the Roadrunner because I have about 10 minutes to say everything I need to say. Telling you about our diversity of learners, the diversity of our learning environments, and what we do for inclusion. So to begin, we have 23,818 learners in our centres by day. These are not nighttime statistics, just by day. Some of them are part-time, but the majority are full-time. They're aged between 15 and 80 years of age. 20% or 1/5 of these students are engaged in community-based learning. So a bit like Carrie said, we have a similar demographic in our learners. We have about 1/3 of our students who are in apprenticeships. So that represents about 8,000 people. 28% or about 6,500, 7,000 of our people are doing QQI level 2 and level 3. These are back to education initiatives, prison education, and community-based adult literacy work. That 2% down there represents about 500 learners that are in one of our 12 Youth Reach centres. Each centre has a different personality of its own. Some of them engage in Leaving Cert programs, some of them don't. And the final or highest rung of our ladder would be level 5 and level 6. That's 17% of our population, and it represents a little over 4,500 learners. 40% of these learners, so about 1,600 learners, are over the age of 30, right up to the age of 80, and quite a lot of them around the early retirement and retirement age as well. About 2,000, or pretty much 50% of them, are raw school leavers, so they're aged 17 to 19 years of age, straight out of Leaving Cert. And there are about 300 or 400 learners across what would be 5 or 6 colleges who have tried out, we'll say, the likes of CIT and UCC, which would be our neighbouring colleges here. They've gone there for a year, 2 years, maybe 3 years, but it hasn't worked out for them for a myriad of reasons, and they're back to us now to try a different route and use our link system to get back into some other college to do some other course of study. So, as Dara said, the Active Inclusion Network up there on the top was put together in 2018. That was the Cork ETB's effort at rolling out the UDL badge at level 5 and level 6. We designated champions of disability, and we put an awful lot of work together to look at what we were doing on the ground in our colleges, etc. So that was put together with Anne Heelan, who is head of AHEAD. I presume she's here today. At the time, we had John Fitzgibbons, our education director, and Liz Moynihan, who would be the director of our Kinsale Further Ed College. One of the requests that this group has put together was that they wanted a new role. They wanted somebody in the Cork ETB with a designated role just to look after inclusion and our students. So last November, that role was filled. Here you are, you're looking at the person in it. And while I'm still teaching, and I will do for the next couple of weeks, well, correct assignments now for the next couple of weeks, I did step into my job in January and I have been doing as much as I can do since then. But to put a sphere on it, I have a support role in charge of our working with 42 centres and 24,000 learners in a myriad of environments. So here to our focus for the next couple of slides on our level 5 and level 6 centres. We start with the College of Commerce, which this year by day has about 1,600 students. Usually it has more like 2,000, but numbers in further ed have been down, particularly this year. Down to we have St. John's Central College, which is nearby there. We have Stefan Nefer, better known as CSN, on the Tramore Road. We have Mallow College of Further Ed. We have Kinsale College of Further Ed, which is our baby college there with 350 learners this year. And we have Skibbereen, which technically is a 6th college, but it is known to be associated with the College of Commerce and attached to that. In all of these colleges, we have disability officers, we have guidance people, we have mature student officers, champions of disability who work on all aspects of access and inclusion, learning support coordinators, again, for everybody, not just those registered with disability. We have learning support teams who take their supervision and substitution hours and do extra tuition in their specialised subjects at designated times, and we've assistive technology coordinators. Because a lot of our further ed colleges were originally secondary schools, and I was still employed as a secondary school teacher, we have all of these people doing all these absolutely wonderful jobs, but an awful lot of them are doing it on a shoestring of time allocation. So we can have disability officers working with anything between 80 and 100 learners, and all they have is 6 or 7 hours allocation in the week to do that. So, and no, they're doing a hell of a lot more than that, but that's their allocation on the ground. So when I stepped into this job, I suppose about 2 months ago, I went to the principals and I asked them for some statistics about the students that we have registered with their disability offices. And we find that about 10% of the students in further ed are registering with these offices, and quite frankly, another 10% at least could do so. 87% of those that are registered are documented. Half of those, roughly speaking, would have things like dyslexia, dyspraxia, and we have a huge rising number of autistic learners from every part of the spectrum. We have 21%, which I find very interesting, which is, I suppose, close to a quarter of our learners that are registered, were identified by the teachers since they came in September. So this means that they were either reluctant to divulge themselves and register, or they didn't know to. Perhaps they were never assessed in the past. Some of them would be some of our older learners. So So at the time of that survey, there were 13% of those that were registered that did not have documents. Some of those were waiting for in-house assessments, and some of those were waiting for external assessments. 17% of those registered have mental health issues, and these are hardcore, serious mental health issues. We have an awful lot more mental health issues in our classrooms than this 17% represents, as they do in every other classroom, I'm sure. And we have 9% physical disabilities on this year's statistics. Okay, so we have huge constraints, and Carrie explained a good few of them in her talk there. Time being the most severe one. We see most of our students for 1 year. There are a tiny percentage of them that come back for a level 6 course, and generally speaking, they're often the weaker students that want another year with us before they'll go on and venture into level 7, 8, 9, and 10. You know, self-directed learning, it doesn't come naturally to people at any level, and particularly at our level, it's a huge concern. We've transition considerations. So it's a big change from secondary school, or a big change from people my age, slightly younger, a bit older, coming back into education, because the classrooms aren't the same now as they were back then. About 2/3 of our learners will qualify for a medical card, so that'll tell you about finances for them. Books are a huge issue. We don't have libraries in all our colleges, but I'm delighted. A couple of days ago, I had a good play with the ETBI's new online library, so I'm delighted. That's one thing I had on my list, my to-do list, and thank you, ETBI, you've taken a job off me. So what do we bring, us teachers in the Cork ETB and in FET centres, what do we bring to the table for our learners? Our main platforms are Moodle and Office 365. All of our centres have instructional leadership trained teachers. We brought UDL, as I said, into level 5 and level 6 about 2 years ago, and we will be doing more UDL badges with our level 5 and level 6 teachers this year. What's more important is we're now breaking into the youth reach centres. So thanks to Trevor and Lisa Padden, I was talking to them in the last 2 weeks, we're now going to have a minimum of 24 youth reach teachers in the autumn, whenever you say, Dara, coming in to do the UDL badge. We've teams in our colleges for years who go away and find out about things like Edpuzzle and Mentimeter and Kahoot and all of these things, and then come back and teach us on campus how to use these and integrate them into our classrooms. Carrie said a lot of what's on this slide here, so I won't bore you too much with it, but when our students come in, getting hooked up with the technology and getting hooked up with the platforms that we use is huge. And that doesn't matter whether they're school leavers or whether they're the older cohort, it really makes very little difference. They all need to be guided gently and securely into a very, very new learning environment for them. So a lot of what's gone on this year in CSN and Tramore Road has been teaching our students and showing them how to use voice to type technology. And I'm not again talking about just people registered with the Disability Office, I'm talking about the whole cohort of students. They really find it very useful to use their phones now, talk part of their assignments in and get them done in time. Our students at Further Ed get this thing called a QQI brief, or an assignment brief. It's a new venture if you're just out of secondary school, and it's a new venture if you're the older cohort. Those coming back from universities and ITs probably find them a lot easier. So we spend a lot of time with communications and work experience components, because all of the students do these, and we unwrap these briefs. It's a document which tells them what to do to evolve their assignments. We have study skills in all of our colleges, and I know in Mallow College there has been a lot. Susanna and Colette have done an awful lot of work on a really good program there. So we'll move on quickly. We're very, very conscious of getting rid of the old medical model. We are aware, obviously, of the social model, but we really are doing everything we can to maintain the UDL environment. Most of our school leavers, we acknowledge, have come from a system where in national school and secondary school, they were inside in its classroom environments with everybody and sundry in there with them. That wouldn't have been something I would have been used to, we'll say, on my day in school. So we're trying to move away now from having all the students that are adults over here, all the students with disabilities in another room, etc. So in CSN, we have a study hub. And the students can come in from 7 or half 7 in the morning until 6 o'clock in the evening. They can get tuition. There's timetables up for different subjects. They can walk in. There's computers there. There's large tables where they can study, but in company. There's little small cubby holes in the corner where they can do that. In St. John's Central College, there's a skills centre as well, which is a similar venture. Somebody mentioned in the chat there earlier about assessments of learners. About 2 years ago, as part of our Active Inclusion Network work as well, and thanks to Nuala Glanton, who's now in charge of Youth Reach, we were all trained up in DAST and R2. So on all of our centres now, we can screen people for dyslexia, but moving forward, we want to do an awful lot more with that. There were discussions in the last few weeks about NCVA, FETAC and now QQI, and how can we let our diverse learners present their material or their portfolios for assessment in a different way. We've always been allowed to do that, but us teachers, we just haven't done it that way. So in the last couple of years, certainly in Cork, this thing is unraveling, and we are doing more of that. Some of us got very excited this year when we had an online scenario. So we love Zoom and everything else, and we wanted to use some of our platform functionality. We wanted to use Moodle and do exams that way. Unfortunately, it's not possible when you can't invigilate that scenario. So we are going to fix that for next year. Zoom, I don't need to say too much about Zoom, do I? We wouldn't be here today. I love it, and I know loads of people, other people do too. So the main things that we are wanting to do is provide more time for the people on the ground who are working in access and inclusion. We want to build up specialised teams for assessments, whereby we we want to, by 2024, we want to be able to assess all literacy skills. We want to be able to assess reading, writing, spelling and maths on campus. We're going to keep sending our students to EdPsychs and to OTs to get the ADHD and ASD diagnoses and any other letter of the alphabet you'd like to mention. But reading, writing, spelling and maths we want to do on campus. We want to build up our transition initiative. So in the College of Commerce and in St. John's, we now have Youth Reach students that are going in and getting a taster of one level 5 component, and they're proving to be very, very successful. And we're going to build on those. We're also going to build on a Moodle program so that we have a more substantial induction program, which really gets kids to participate, and the adults too, sorry, to participate. Just like us teachers had to just jump in there and participate in the last number of weeks, even though some of us might not have been so fond of the idea. We really want, down at the bottom, Christine will laugh at this when she sees it, an active inclusion conference in Cork. That is the pièce de résistance of our activities. We were about to have a meeting the day before the lockdown on setting this thing up, and all I can say is, Tara, by the looks of things, we may well be following in your tracks and doing this online. So UDL is being rolled out in our level 5 and 6 centres. It's then being rolled out starting next autumn in our Youth Reach centres, and after that we will address the wilderness of apprenticeships. You know, we have an awful lot of different practitioners, and we have teachers, and we have tutors, and we have instructors who, as Carrie explained, may or may not have different levels of experience of working with people with extra special needs. So this is what the Cork UPD
That's wonderful,
are
Carol.
trying to do.
It sounds like you have a lot on your plate there. Now you're relatively new into that role, but you're getting stuck in. I can see very much so. So it's lovely to see the breadth of work going on there. Interested in the whole area of UDL and Youth Reach, and just to see, you know, you kind of selected Youth Reach as the next place, I suppose, after your PLC colleges to have a look at really trying to bed down UDL. Is there a reason why you selected Youth Reach, and what's been kind of the response? Is it coming from Youth Reach that are kind of demanding this, or is it that you've kind of picked Youth Reach as somewhere where you think is an ideal breeding ground for UDL?
Well, certainly Nuala, on behalf of her staff and her teams, absolutely wants this to happen. But it is a natural progression. We expect a lot of the Youth Reach students to come from there into us. And therefore, if they're used to a certain environment there, they will fit into our environment more so. We spent an awful lot of time, Carrie intimated again about it, we spent an awful lot of time trying to unravel what it's like to be an FE student. We have student briefs, we have the different timetables. We have assignments. This whole idea of not having of Christmas exams, some of the Leaving Cert students or the new raw recruits just find so interesting, and they've been indoctrinated for years and years with Christmas exams, and it's kind of a weird and wonderful thing for them. So again, as I said, self-directed learning is not something that comes naturally to everybody, and that's for HE environments as well. We already have instructional leadership trained tutors in our youth reach centres. There's been a huge effort done. I was at a meeting even the other day about all these literacy strategies that they've put in place in the centres. So they're really bringing the level of tuition and the environment and the learning environment up to meet the needs of the diverse learners that are there.
That's fantastic. Listen, I'm really impressed with the work going on. So thank you both for the presentation, really enlightening, and also for the work that you're doing in Cork ETB. I know we'll be linking in with you again pretty soon, I think, on your plans regarding the digital badge. So
That's it.
I'm really delighted to hear that you're looking at that expansion into youth reach. That's really welcome. So if you wouldn't mind saying goodbye, Carol, we'll ask you just to mute your video and audio. Trevor, if you could just begin to unmute yours and perhaps to just share the slides about next week. Just while you're doing that, I just want to share a comment from Irene in the sort of Q&A box here, and it's really just a call out that I'd like to call out to the rest of the participants to see if they have any ideas for her that they could post into the chat box. So Irene lives in rural Ireland. She's trying to support people that cannot access further education as it's very limited there. There is a social farming movement and she wants to bring more training in it. She really feels like she's on her own and there's nobody there to exchange experience like people have been talking about here today. So she's saying most research and tips are classroom based and mostly for academic subjects. So she's wondering, is there any tips on where she can turn to for advice and experience and kind of that exchange. So I've offered Irene as to maybe engage with some head staff in here as a bounce board to look, but if there's anybody in the chat box maybe that has any ideas, please do share them with Irene in there. That would be great. So Trevor, what did you think? How did you get on today? How did you find it?
Well, that's great. Well, I was just ablaze with Twitter there for the whole time, so I tried to capture as many of the quotes as possible, and even the responses in the chat box were so good. I ended up started copying and pasting them into Twitter as well, because even there was so many kind of great insights there. So I haven't named anyone who's been quoted in the chat box, but feel free to try and find any comments that you might have made and click like and share. But overall, I mean, there were 3 incredible presentations, and I think we got a huge sense of not only great work that's currently being done, but fantastic plans about building on that work as well, which is amazing to see. Also, it's interesting to see there's still the need for support, for that great work as well. So, like the point Patricia was making, there's no such thing as being 100% inclusive all the time. The journey continues on and on and on and grows. So I think that was apparent throughout all the presentations as well.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I thought it was a fascinating journey today, and looking at, I suppose, 3 very different kind of levels. One is that Mary and Patricia really brought that kind of research and the thinking about UDL. That actually maybe it's good for us as a sector to begin with the thinking before we go diving into all of this. That we can actually start with a solid base before we dive in. Carrie's actually on the ground there doing great work in terms of the actual networking. She's someone who's actually started from the grassroots up herself.
Okay.
And then Carol here looking at the ETB perspective and what you can do at that kind of systemic level at the ETB level. I think it's really interesting to see those different aspects of it. But before I just ask you to close by introducing next week, Trevor, just a couple more things into the kind of chat and Q&A box here.
Yeah.
Liz has mentioned or referenced that Carol mentioned the study skills program in Mallow College, and she's just wondering, is it possible for Carol to share those study tips? So Carol, if there's any links or anything you could post in the chat box, or even afterwards if you want to share it with us and we can pass them on to Liz. Catherine Joyce, who I think in reference to Irene's comment, has said that she should check in with the Roscommon leader for advice, that they are very geared towards rural learners. So perhaps there might be an avenue there to share. So I think, would you like to kind of tee up what's happening next week before we say goodbye to everyone?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, next week, of course, we have another webinar on Friday as well, around the same time. So feel free to go to the Conference 2020 webpage in the HEAD website to register and book a place for next week. It's a much more student-centered one next week with students themselves. So it's all about student perspectives, nothing about us without us. And in the first session, it's facilitated by our own Hannah Kelly here from HEAD. And the students are Gillian Stafford, Vicky Matthews, um, Christina Miles, and the theme is making a change on and off campus with student leadership and activism. So that's going to be a really energetic, kind of lively discussion, I think, with real student insights. And to complete the session, one of those students, Gillian Stafford from Maynooth University, will be giving a presentation called Day in the Life of a Student with a Visual Impairment on Campus. And I think that's going to be really valuable insight from a student perspective about how that student kind of manages her day-to-day interactions on a campus. So I'm really looking forward to that one.
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, ultimately, we've been talking a lot about UDL and things today, but ultimately, it's really important factor in that is that we give students agency in this process. And I think this is going to be an interesting one to see. I know this panel initially began as completely about the idea of how students can make positive contributions on their own campus to inclusion, and obviously with the COVID issues we might be looking at some of that too. But yeah, I think it's really important for colleges and centres to make space for students to have that role, you know, that agency in how the college actually goes about their business, and making sure that they're listening closely to what the students need.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Listen, I suppose that's the end of our Friday. I'd like to wish everybody a lovely weekend. Don't forget the hashtag is ahead 2020. So if you want to continue the conversation on Twitter, and in fact, we'd actually, if you've enjoyed your session here today, it'd be really helpful for us if you could tell everyone that you did so on Twitter and tag at ahead Ireland. And that would be fantastic in terms of trying to get people to engage with the rest of the sessions here that are left in the conference. So thank you very much to everybody, to all our brilliant contributors. Really enjoyed it, and to you, Trevor, as well, for starting the chat box and getting everybody engaged. And I wish everyone a lovely weekend, and take care.
Super. Thanks very much.
Bye bye.
Goodbye, everyone.